Why do some people consider fairies to be androgynous? So this is a question I started asking myself in 2018, and then in 2019 when I was at the Ohio State Fairies and the Fantastic Conference, it was raised as a question to the keynote speaker. She couldn't answer it. Honestly, at the time, I couldn't answer it either. But it definitely made me very curious, more curious, and so I kind of dove into the topic and did a sort of deep dive, we could say. And basically, here's what's going on. So, historically, in the oldest sources, and in even still some of the modern, culturally specific sources, we see this idea of fairies as being very clearly gendered and also very explicitly sexual. So, the term elf and fairy historically was equated to or used synonymously with the terms incubi and succubi. So, very explicitly sexual beings. What happened was in the Victorian era, in the 1850s forward, there was a big push by the Victorian middle class and upper class to kind of relegate fairies to children's literature, which is not where they had been prior to that. They became sort of the domain of children. They were associated with imagination and fancy dress and all this other stuff. And in that process, they really infantilized fairies. These were people who did not believe that fairies actually existed, but saw them as this sort of cute superstition that other people had, and so just sort of took them and made use of them however they chose, and really started this process of viewing fairies as very childlike beings, childlike in their actions, also childlike in their appearance. This is the first time we really start to see fairies described as looking like children themselves. Think of like Cicely Mary Barker's flower fairies, which are always these children with wings. That was not how they were seen before that, or how they're seen still in other cultures, but that was kind of the effect that the Victorian era had on the pop culture and British and American understanding of fairies. Now, add into that Theosophy coming in at the end of the 19th century. Theosophy described fairies as these very primitive, childlike, amoral spirits who were hoping to one day evolve up to human incarnation, but had a long way to go towards that, and were just very childlike in their perceptions and behaviors. So again, we have this emphasis on them as being very much like children. Now, as we get into the 20th century, the New Age movement kind of gets a hold of the Theosophical fairies and turns them into ascended masters. These are beings now who have actually evolved beyond humans, and hence beyond the concepts of gender, beyond the concept of sex, beyond all of those sort of more primitive things. So they took that Theosophical view and flipped it on its head and went at it from the other direction. But what this resulted in is a kind of wide understanding, both in popular culture and among a lot of witches and pagans, of fairies as sort of androgynous spirits that are beyond, again, these concepts of gender and sexuality and all of that, and have sort of morphed at this point into an idea you can find again in some demographics that fairies just inherently don't have those concepts. These are also views that see fairies as very non-physical spirits, as guides, as very helpful beings, which again, sharply contrasted with both the older material and a lot of the still existing culturally specific material. But ultimately, that is the answer to the question, why do some people consider fairies to be androgynous? Because the Victorian era infantilized them, Theosophy reduced them to childlike spirits as well, and then the New Age came in, flipped that on its head, took all of that, kept them as childlike a lot of times in physical form, and turned them into these sort of genderless, sexless spirits who just sort of exist to help humans. It's a very niche understanding of these beings, but it nonetheless has impacted other views connected to that, even people who would not say they follow the New Age movement or follow Theosophy or particularly interested in the Victorian era. Nonetheless, this has all shaped the way that some people can understand these beings, and that is kind of where that all comes from, this combination of all these things. I did so much research into this. In fact, if you're still interested in the subject and want to learn more, I wrote an entire book called Pain with a Kiss, Love and Sex and Fairy Belief, which is just focused on this particular question. How have we understood fairies in relation to these things? How do we understand them that way today? How are they viewed in some of these different communities? All of that. I even get into like some of the stuff that'll occasionally float around social media, like on Tumblr, relating to these topics. So if it interests you.